Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Looks like maybe a couple of people are still waiting for their audio to connect, but thanks so much for joining us this morning. I'm really glad to have you here. My name is Brianne Lott, and I'm a Global Career Initiatives Coordinator with Career and Professional Development Services at ASU. And with me today is my colleague, Olivia Fallon. And we're going to be presenting about different interview strategies. So really excited for this session this morning. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You probably noticed that everybody is muted currently. So we're just gonna keep you on mute during the presentation. You can feel free to use the chat function to type in any questions or comments throughout the presentation. Please do use the chat. And then we'll leave some time at the end of the presentation for question and answer. And so it may be possible to unmute yourself for some questions at the end of the presentation. This meeting is being recorded, so I will send an email next week with the link to this recording. So feel free to go back and rewatch any parts if that's helpful for you. And I think that's everything. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Olivia.
Awesome, great. Well, thank you all for joining me this morning. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Cool. So today we'll be talking a little bit about preparing for an interview. I'm pretty interactive, so if you do have any questions, comments, maybe tips you found yourself, you're welcome to post it in the chat box. And yeah, just as an introduction, my name is Olivia Fallon. I work as a career industry specialist with CPDS. I always just like to do a little fun fact, hometown. I think it helps people connect with the speaker more. I'm originally from Roanoke, Virginia, so that's from Southern Virginia, basically. So if you hear a little bit of an accent, that's why. Fun fact, never been to California or really traveled much on the West Coast at all. So still fairly new to Arizona. I also attended Clemson University for my master's and Old Dominion for my bachelor's. So just as kind of an introduction, icebreaker, if you'll post in the chat box your name, hometown, fun fact, and let's say if you've ever done an interview in the US. And I'll give you just a moment. One more second. Okay, we'll move on for the sake of time. But if you do feel so inclined, I would love to know just a little bit more about you all. Okay, got one. Cool. Thanks, Tarek. You're scared of elevators. Nice. I haven't heard that fun fact yet. Okay. So just as kind of an overview, we're going to discuss how to prepare for interviews, dressing for success, interview types, first impression, some of the types of questions you'll be asked, and follow-up. So before we jump into any presentation, I always like to discuss the career competencies. So if you're not familiar, these are published by NACE, which also stands for the National Association of Colleges and Employers. Excuse me. So basically NACE surveys employers throughout the United States each year and asks what are the top skills you're looking for in your new candidates. And this is this list that surfaced for 2019. I'll also add, this list is not specific to any discipline, major, industry, but rather they interview companies across the board, ranging from engineering firms to software companies and kind of everything in between. My last comment on this is if you ever have an interview and you're wondering, you know, what are some of the questions they may ask me or even some of the skills they're looking for, This is definitely that list. So they may ask you, tell me about your leadership experience, tell me about your problem solving and critical thinking abilities, things of that nature. So I like to focus on this question specifically because this is one of the first questions people get asked in an interview, and I find consistently this question trips up both American students and international students because the initial reaction is, well, what do you want to know about me? When someone says, tell me about yourself. So in this question, there's really 3 parts to this answer. And if you have a pen and paper, I would recommend writing this down. So the first part is, who are you currently? So what's your name, major, year at school? So are you first year, second year, third year, fourth year, or graduate student? Why are you interested in this field or job? So what is your passion behind pursuing this internship or full-time opportunity? And then conclude your answer with, why are you interested in this company? So I'm just going to give an example kind of off the cuff. Let's say I'm applying to a software development internship. I would say, hi, my name is Olivia Fallon. I am a freshman here at ASU studying mathematics, I don't know. And I'm really passionate about software development because I love to be creative, and it also pairs my passion for working in technology, and I think it's in a really up and coming field. And so that's why I'm pursuing this internship here at Microsoft, because of how far reaching your software is, and I would love to just be a part of your company's mission. Something like that. That's kind of an off the cuff thing to really explain who you are. Some students I've noticed with this question will fall into the trap of talking about all their hobbies or their like personal lives. Those are topics you really want to avoid unless they're asking you, you know, what do you like to do for fun or something like that. So now we'll kind of jump into some interviewing tips. So just some general tips in the US, if you're interviewing, you typically want to arrive about 10 minutes early. Have extra copies of your resume. So in an interview, they may not ask you, you know, for your resume, but it's better to be prepared than not. So anytime I have an interview, I always print off around 10 copies, and printing it out on resume paper. So resume paper is like a thicker grade of paper it's like a little yellowish in tint. You can find it at Walmart, Staples, what have you. Anytime you're going to really any professional event and you're bringing copies of your resume, you generally want to print it out on resume paper. You always want to keep your answers work related. And again, this is something I see that a lot of students don't realize. So they start talking about their family or if they're married. And I know in some other countries, that is an expectation to really know you holistically. But I would say in interviews here in the US, they really only want to know about you as a professional. And then of course, if you get the job, they want to know about you more as a person. And then my other general tip would be always provide a specific example in your answers. So let's say they're asking you, you know, what's your greatest strength? You don't want to just say, well, my greatest strength is that I'm hardworking and I'm detail oriented and I am passionate about my work and I am very collaborative, which that is a type of answer I would say I get at least 60% of the time when I ask this question. Is students will just start listing out a myriad of qualities. My recommendation would be typically list 1 to 2 attributes and then provide a really specific example of when you acted in that attribute. So how to prepare. One of the best things you can do is research the employer. So I know when I was an undergrad, I didn't realize how much research it takes to do well in an interview. And then by the time I got to graduate school, when I did have interviews and I was in the job search, I was researching for some interviews, maybe 2 hours at least, researching like the institution, their mission, their vision, their values, their strategic initiatives, their social media pages, how many people were on staff in the department I was applying to. Because oftentimes employers will ask you, what research have you done about our company? And if you don't have anything to say, that usually, I won't say that usually won't get you the job, but that's a huge deterrent. because if you're passionate about a role, you're going to do your research. Think of questions to ask. So at the very end of the interview, they're going to ask you, what questions do you have for us? So that's when you want to have at least, I would say, 3 questions already written down that you'd like to ask the employer. Just some examples of that would be, what do you look for in a successful candidate? How would you describe your company culture? What does professional development look like at this organization? Anything like that. Decide what to bring. So if you have a really long interview, I would recommend bringing maybe a bottle of water, a book to read, even a snack. Some interviews are like day-long processes. Many are not, but some are, depending on the position. So definitely think about that beforehand. And then practice interviewing. This is really one of the best things you can do if you do or don't have an interview coming up, honestly, because it's a skill that you should regularly be refining. You can actually schedule a mock interview in Career and Professional Development Services, and we'll craft the questions based on your industry, the employer, job title, all that. So kind of just breaking it down, research. As mentioned, this is one of the key points you can do. I know I interviewed a student once. He was applying to a position, I want to say with the U.S. House of Representatives. He wanted to work in government. And the first question I asked was, what research have you done? And immediately you could tell he was panicking, like fumbling in our mock interview, because he had done hardly any research. And that really shows it's hard to fake, lack of research. So definitely do that. Thinking of questions beforehand. So being thoughtful about, the questions you want to ask. Typically speaking, students will ask me like, well, what should I ask them? But I would recommend going the route of thinking about your work values. So if having a flexible schedule is important to you, asking what a typical work week looks like. Maybe you really value that professional development. You want to be trained, acquire new certifications, asking about professional development may be helpful. Maybe you've had, I don't know, this is more negative, but maybe you haven't had the best experience with a boss in the past position. It may be helpful to ask, what would my relationship with my supervisor look like? Anything like that I think is helpful. As mentioned, so this is a Padfolio on the right. It's essentially a leather, how do I explain it? Like a leather notebook or folder. And in it is where you would house your resumes, your notepad, pen, and whatever else you need. You, of course, don't have to have this if you have an interview, but it is a nice thing to carry along with you. So I would recommend at some point, if you can, getting one of these. But again, absolutely like not a necessity, like an employer's not going to judge you if you don't have a Padfolio. And then I just threw in a bottle of water. So again, practice interviewing. I've worked with some students that have had to schedule 3 and 4 mock interviews just to get up to speed. So I would recommend, if you're in the boat of maybe you even don't have an interview coming up, still scheduling like a 30-minute mock interview so you can at least gauge where you are as far as your interviewing skills. I know when I was in college, I was honestly such a terrible interviewer. It kind of makes me cringe now. And so I really didn't gain any confidence in interviewing until I practiced a ridiculous amount. I'll go to the chat really quickly. Yes, the recording of the meeting will be available later. So dressing for success. If you do have an interview coming up, I would recommend dressing in more business professional attire. It would probably be beneficial to do some research on the company, so to see what they require. So for example, on glassdoor.com, you can actually look at the questions people have been asked. You can look at, salary information, things of that nature. So definitely check that website out. But as kind of a sample spreadsheet of how you should look, you can kind of see business casual versus business professional. It's always good to wear a blazer if you can, or a cardigan, slacks, or a long skirt, and then closed-toed shoes. It's also good to wear more muted colors, so your darks, or your like dark grays, blacks, blues. Nothing too bright and exciting unless you're in a more creative field such as graphic communications or marketing. I would also recommend, like, buying professional clothes can be very expensive, which I totally understand. As a little insider tip, you can find a lot of really great professional clothes at Goodwill. I found some great blazers. Most of my dress shirts are from Goodwill. They're secondhand. So definitely check that out before you go dropping tons of money when you can get some of those same clothes at like other places. Okay, and then the types of interviews. So this is a question I get asked a lot as well. If you're applying for an internship, typically you're gonna have, I would say, 2 interviews, maybe 3 max if it's a really competitive one. If you're applying for a full-time job, typically I would say expect to have 3 interviews. The first one is almost always over the phone or through Zoom. Since we're in kind of this COVID-19 pandemic, pretty much all of it will be virtual, I would imagine, but you never know. So you want to prepare for all of these different mediums. Actually, I'll go back really quick. So one suggestion I would have is if you're going to meet over Zoom or phone, just know who's supposed to be calling who first. If it's a phone call, so that you're not wondering, like, was I supposed to call them? You kind of want to have all those things ironed out prior to the interview. If it's Zoom, make sure your background is completely blank. When I had Zoom interviews back in college, I would spend like 15 minutes just taking everything off my wall so that there's a blank background when I would talk to the interviewer. I have seen some Zoom interviews where people have a ton of stuff on their walls, and that's just very distracting, to be honest. So definitely take that time to do that. So in an interview, there's 3 types of questions: traditional, behavioral, and technical. So traditional questions are the more general questions, such as what's your greatest strength, what's your greatest weakness, what's your leadership style, tell me about yourself. All of those are very traditional questions that you expect in almost any interview. Again, the biggest pitfall I find with a lot of people that don't have experience interviewing is that they don't give examples for traditional interview questions. So again, with the tell me about yourself, or not tell me about yourself, but greatest strength, students will just list off a ton of different qualities, but not back it up to any specific example. You want to make sure you do that. Behavioral is when you really should be backing it up to an example. So if they're saying, tell me about a time you've had a conflict with a coworker, tell me about a time you felt overwhelmed. Anytime you're being asked a behavioral question, it's pretty much always going to start with, tell me about a time. So kind of the formula to giving an example is, first, when you're giving that example, is giving the context or situation. So I've had some interviews where I'll ask a student, tell me about a time you were stressed or something like that. And they'll immediately just jump into the situation. Like, I was at work and I was overbooked with my calendar. And as an interviewer, you're wondering, like, what's the situation? Like, when was this? What was the job even? Like, you know, that sort of thing. You want to give context to the story. The task. So explain what your responsibility was. The action, how did you respond to that situation? And then give the result. So you want to give the outcome of your answer. A lot of people forget that piece as well. They'll give a scenario, but then as an interviewer, you're wondering, like, what happened? So you just want to tie that up really nicely. Also, as a rule of thumb, typically your interview answer should only be about a minute to a minute 30 in length. Most people shy around like the 30-second mark, so you want to practice so that you're being elaborative in your answer. And then the last set of questions are typically technical, and this is where it's like a test, and they're testing you on your technical abilities if you're in a more STEM focused field. So an example would be maybe you're applying to a coding job. You may get a coding test where you're required to solve a code or figure out the errors or that sort of thing. And then, as mentioned, these are some questions to ask at the conclusion of your interview. As a side note, you never want to ask, how much does this position pay? What are the benefits? Again, you can find some of those answers on Glassdoor before you even have the interview, and hopefully it's in the job description. But if not, you don't typically want to ask that in a first or second round interview. I have worked with some students that did that, and then they were like, so cringy, like, I know I did not get that job because I asked that question. So just avoid it if you can. You should avoid it. Try to think of more questions based around the position itself. And then remember to follow up. So anytime I had an interview, I would set a calendar reminder way before the interview to send a thank you email because I knew I would forget after the interview was over. In your thank you email, it's literally very short, concise. You just want to say, dear so-and-so, thank you again for meeting with me this past week for an interview. I really enjoyed hearing about your company and blah, blah, blah. If you have any additional questions about my qualifications, don't hesitate to reach out. Something just very concise. And at the conclusion of all of our presentations, we like to ask, what is one thing you will do in the next 24 hours that will put you on the path to success? And the sooner you start, the further you'll go. So at this time, if you do have any additional questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. If you want like clarification on anything I said, again, I'll give you just a couple minutes to go ahead and post those questions. Okay, so in a phone Zoom interview where it's hard to read body language, I don't know how to show I am listening, how long I can take to respond, to think, and how not to interrupt people talking. Any suggestions? Yeah, so this can be really hard, especially over the phone. So this is kind of cheesy, but when I would have phone interviews, I would practice smiling while I was giving my answer because you sound a lot happier because they don't see your face to see that you're happy and seem excited. So that's like one trick is to literally just practice smiling if you have a phone interview. And regarding showing your body language, I would recommend if you need a second to think, just say, give me 1 second, let me think about that. That's totally fine. We're not like putting the pressure to have you say something immediately. It's okay to like think about your answer. So just tell them you need 1 second. Additionally, if you ever don't know the answer to an interview question, you can say like, you can be honest and say, I'm honestly not sure. I would love to do more research on that to get the answer, but I want to be honest. That's, again, like obviously you don't want to have that answer for every interview question, but that's better than making something up on the spot. So that's another little side note. Can we also follow up if we got the position job or not? I'm not sure what you mean by that, I'm sorry. If you want to, clarify your question a little bit. Do you mean, can you follow up if you got the job? Oh, I get what you're saying. Okay. In the follow-up email, can we ask if you got the job? So no, in the follow-up email, you're never asking if you got the position. You're simply just thanking them for their time and telling them, you're available if they do have any additional questions. You never want to ask if you got the job because they'll reach out to you and let you know. I would also recommend, this is another little side note, if you're in the job search or getting ready to start, creating an Excel document that houses every single job you've applied to if you've interviewed there. So when I was in the job search, I had a column that was like name of the company, name of the job title, the position description. So I took a screenshot of the position description because typically speaking, an employer will take down that position description if they get enough applicants. And then if you've applied to a lot of jobs, you forget what the job even was. So definitely save that, and then calculate 2 weeks ahead of when you want to follow up with the employer from the application, as well as notate if you got an interview. Any other questions? If not, that's totally fine. I'll give you 1 more minute. Awesome, thank you. Cool, well, if you do have any questions, you're welcome to email me, schedule a meeting with me in Handshake. My email is Olivia, actually I'll just put it in the group chat, that's gonna be easier. It's olivia.fallen@asu.edu. Actually won't be in the next session, sadly. But if you do have any questions, of course, I'm always here. So you're welcome to email me or schedule an appointment. So yeah, thank you all for your time and have a great rest of your Thursday.
Thanks, Olivia. Everyone have a great rest of your day. Hope to see you in the next session about interview stream at 11 a.m.
Thank you.
Thank you.